Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. Je vous remercie de votre invitation à Hello Tomorrow Global Summit. I'm so excited to talk with you about my favorite topic, fission, and about the company Oklo that I co-founded. So I'm especially happy to be here in France talking about this topic because France is the leading example of a country that has deeply decarbonized on a rapid scale using nuclear power, essentially fission being the reaction that underlies nuclear power. And right now, there's a wave of fission innovation, and I'm excited to talk with you about that as well. When people ask why would I dedicate my life and a good portion of my life to founding this company and working towards deploying fission energy, one of the reasons would be encapsulated by what's on this slide right here. The idea that you could fuel your entire life's worth of electricity with a golf ball-sized amount of fuel is an incredible example of the energy density that's inherent in fission. So it's really incredible to think about, all the things you power with your life, your laptop, your cell phone, all of your electronics, your internet, heating, cooling, refrigeration, and so forth. And it is a $1 trillion market globally. But you also think about the social justice issues and the planet and health and climate. And certainly those are things that need to be addressed. And by using energy that is very energy dense is a key way to address these key issues that we all face. So when we look at that, I think one of the best metrics and one of the reasons I always point to as something that I care deeply about is there's many options out there for energy, and we can use many different tools. But one of the things we may want to optimize towards is actually the lowest life cycle carbon emissions for a given energy source. And so here you can see an example on the screen of different energy sources and their life cycle carbon emissions. And yes, this includes from mining through construction and operations, so that really encapsulates a lot of what is required to produce a certain amount of energy. And so this is levelized out for energy production. But to really get a sense, you really couldn't see fission on the other slide, so I added a log chart. So of course, each major line is 10 times more than the next. So with that chart, it's exponential, and you can actually see how fission stacks up in terms of life cycle carbon footprint. And the IPCC recently issued an update on life cycle carbon emissions just this year and reaffirmed that fission is at the lowest of life cycle carbon footprint. I think it's fun to show this cartoon. It's one of the illustrations of the fact that anything that's millions of times more energy dense than something else is fundamentally difficult for the human mind to understand. We might understand 2 times or 10 times, but you get 1,000 or 1,000,000. It's very difficult to kind of comprehend. And so we end up using things like log charts or various other things, but in the end, it is difficult. Here, it's comparing actually the amount of energy that comes from combusting a molecule. So you think of fossil fuels. Here we have sugar, fat, coal, gasoline. Combustion and how much energy it produces. And then one fission reaction and how much energy that produces. You can see it's millions of times the same amount of energy. It is hard to think about something a million times. Another example I give is, for instance, the difference between the speed of the fastest human and the speed of light. Still hard to comprehend because the speed of light feels relatively instantaneous, but that's maybe another example that I point to. I think when you think about the energy density here, one of the other ways to think about it is actually how many materials are required to build a power plant of a given energy type. And so here you can see certainly fossil fuels leads the pack in amount of materials, and largely that is the fuel itself. And here again, you really can't see fission on this scale, so we'll zoom in, and you can see it compared to different renewable sources. And here you can see a little bit with better fidelity. So, concrete, steel, glass, and so forth. Requiring the least amount of materials ties into that idea of having the lowest overall carbon footprint. It means less transportation, less mining, and so forth. And so that's very important for the future of our planet. Another thing to point to is actually land use. And again, here you can't see it, so I'm going to lean on the log chart even as it was denigrated in the prior cartoon. And here you can see how much less land use. And this is really important for sensitive ecosystems and areas like we talk to islanded communities where land is at a premium. And so both for the planet and for humans, many times land use is at a premium, and that's an important thing to optimize for as well. certainly a question ends up coming up, what about the safety? And we have decades worth of data about safety. And if you look at the comparison, I think the biggest global challenge is really the millions of people being killed by fossil fuels each year. And how do we all work towards rectifying that and optimizing to fix that problem? So you can see comparisons, and nuclear is at the lowest when it comes to fatalities, even when including the largest accidents of all time. Here I'm just talking about history of fission and nuclear power, generally speaking. But let me be clear, I think what we're doing at Oklo is intended to be fundamentally different from that. And we don't believe it has to be done like it was done 10, 50 years ago, when things were designed with slide rules and so forth. Like many of the plants existing today, they have these characteristics, but we can do things fundamentally in a new way. And in fact, it's been proven out. It just didn't get commercialized. And that could be its own talk about why didn't that happen. But I think one of the things we see now is an impetus because of people caring much more broadly and much more sincerely about climate to really look at our emission-free options, and that's what's driving a new look at these technologies that were actually proven out over the decades. One of which that we at Oklo have really focused on is actually a technology that's proven out. And so in terms of safety, it actually has inherent safety. And just to illustrate that, they did testing where they actually had the reactor at full power, shut off all the cooling, and turned off all the shutdown systems, and then waited to see what would happen. And it shut itself down. And it turned right back on. It had no damage. And so having those inherent physics safety characteristics that actually it shuts itself down without needing active systems, without needing cooling and so forth is something that we wanted to bring to bear and actually commercialize. And also it had, that same year, you can see on the slide, actually sold power to the grid at reasonable cost rates and also demonstrated a reuse of nuclear waste as fuel. So taking nuclear waste and turning it into clean energy is another part of our passion and why we chose what we did to commercialize. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Oklo and the technology that we're working on. Our first powerhouse we've called the Aurora. And so a little bit about us. At Oklo, it was really born of the dreams of some graduate students who were like, hey, there's these cool technologies. Let's see if we can do a startup on this. And we did, to the chagrin, or at least against the advice of perhaps older people who were like, oh, it's been tried or it can't be done. And I think what we've seen is you can really make some real progress when you try to do something. But it does mean you have to do everything differently. And not just the technology, but also our business model. And our business model is really to build, own, and operate. So the historical method would be to actually have these huge companies like General Electric or Westinghouse design these huge projects that they sell then to utilities that have these multi-billion-dollar or multi-euro-dollar projects that, generally speaking, ratepayers or taxpayers are footing the bill for. And they may or may not feel like they have a decision in the process. And what we wanted to do is say, hey, we'll take on all those capital costs and we'll just sell you the power. You pay for the power if we provide it to you, and that way it's more opt-in. So communities come to us saying, hey, we want this as part of our zero carbon grid, and we work with them as far as selling power, and we handle all of the other pieces. So I think that's been a key innovation and a key separation of Oklo versus a lot of different people who are working on similar technologies but haven't really thought about how they're going to commercialize it in terms of the business model. We've reached some milestones, so you can see on the screen. We were actually the first to be awarded fuel material by the U.S. Department of Energy. We were also selected for having a site, and actually selected our final site for our first powerhouse. And our very first powerhouse is not just a demo, it's actually our first commercial plant. And so there's that, and at the same time, we also had to do regulatory work completely differently. In the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually hasn't had an application start under it that actually started operation. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission started it in 1974. So everything had to be new, everything had to be different, but we've seen some milestones there. We currently have the only combined license application under review. Combined license means it's for construction and operation. So we're under review. It was accepted for review, which itself was historic, and we anticipate that we're only about a couple years away from receiving that license or completing our review. So what I'm trying to tell you is it's not a decade away. It may be something more like a few years away, and this isn't pie in the sky. It's been done before, and so it's really neat to actually prove it out. So to speak a little bit more about the Aurora, which is our powerhouse, I think what I usually start with is basically saying it is completely different from anything you ever heard of with nuclear. It uses fission, but everything else is different. So the fuel is different. We don't require any water for cooling. We don't have any water at all. The size is completely different. It's about a megawatt. And we call that microgrid scale. And we're looking at larger sizes, but still within that microgrid size, typically speaking, for these first plants. It has these fundamental inherent safety characteristics. It can consume waste. It can load follow. So this just really looks very different. And it starts with fission, but it really, the similarities in there with regard to the existing nuclear fleet. And so it's very interesting to look at what does it look like when you have small, inherently safe plants that can really integrate with the community. So you see a lovely rendering kind of in the background there of what our building looks like. The footprint is like the size of a large house, and it actually is very easy to be sited in different places. And like actually the very beginning of today, one of the speakers talked about how important art is to humans and to deploying deep technology. We believe the same. And we utilize the sides of the building with the solar panels as effectively art canvases to hopefully customize the building based on the community that it's in and help engage humans with this new technology and with our powerhouses. So we're really excited about it. But even if, as it's very cool, what we've seen is, it's a beautiful building or clean power, but at the same time, you have to really make it cost effective or you don't really have a customer. And so what we see as keys to that cost effectiveness is two things, really, if you boil it down. One is that inherent safety. If you have safety that is inherent, then you don't actually have to rely on a bunch of active systems, a lot of human training that's prone to human error, and so many things that add cost. When you have that safety be inherent or physics safe, then it really strips away some of those other costs that we've seen historically in the industry. And also about recycling waste, actually. It's not just a feel-good idea of let's do something with waste. It's actually a more efficient way of producing fuel for our plants. So that's a key, and I'd like to delve into that a little further with you. So it's really fascinating, possibly. The existing nuclear plants, generally speaking, around the world, typically use a few percent of the energy in the fuel, and then about 95% of it gets turned into nuclear waste. There's so much energy left in that fuel that needs to be utilized or can be utilized, and we're excited to do that. And our technology can actually recycle. What could that mean? Well, let's assume a globe of 10 billion people, all consuming electricity at US per capita rates. How long could that power the globe? Well, actually using existing waste in the world today, we could power the entire globe of 10 billion people at US electricity rates for hundreds of years without doing any further mining, just on existing waste. If we add mining, then you get into thousands of years. If you add the energy that is actually in seawater, you get to tens of thousands of years. And if you consider over very long time scales, the actual turnover of the Earth's plates can get you out to really far. In fact, past where we think the sun will essentially subsume the earth in heat. So it's really interesting to think about when it says inexhaustible, it feels like we should say effectively inexhaustible, but really is inexhaustible when it comes to human anticipation of human lifespans on this planet, or basically any species that we know of today. I wanted to conclude this talk with a little bit of a call to action. Hopefully some of the things you heard today were interesting or new to you, something interesting. As you're thought leaders in this audience and you're influential, bring this to your discussions about what should we do, how should we as a societies around the globe think about what we prioritize for our planet and for our health. And I think there's some very interesting facts here. I'm very excited, of course, about my company, Oklo, but I think that would be my call to action, is just to bring some of this hopefully new knowledge and learn more about it and bring that to your discussions in the future. I look forward to your questions. Thank you again for having me.
Hi, Caroline. I'm here again to ask you some questions. You said, let's have some questions. And let me ask, is everybody embracing this idea, I mean, you have already, shown some really, really cool benefits, but some countries we just talked about also backstage have already decided they all want to go for renewables and not use that. But it might be a cool bridge, sort of making the gap between what's possible with renewables, also regarding the energy transition. So have you shown this to other countries, and have they been the same kind of excited as the US where you come from? Or are there also countries where you go like, well, I'm not so sure if they will make that kind of bridging technology work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think each country, just like each community, makes its own decisions about what they want their grid to look like. But what I've seen is we've had so much inbound interest from people all over the world. I might say maybe especially in developing areas where they're hungry for reliable power. So they may already have solar panels or so forth, or with batteries, and maybe that gets through some number of hours, but they're hungry to have 24/7 power like we have in developed areas. And so we see that from countries in Africa and in some other countries as well. We've seen a number of different countries with significant appetite, Eastern Europe and South America and so forth. So I think it really depends. I do think the United States is a leader in this. In the United States, we've seen political parties, it's a very bipartisan issue. Shockingly enough, there's really not many.
Not happening all the time.
It's basically the only bipartisan issue I can think of at the moment, but actually we see it as a place where Democrats in the United States and Republicans care about it for their own reasons, but actually care about deploying advanced fission specifically. I do see a difference in how people perceive historical nuclear power and advanced fission as well.
And you were mentioning the licensing issues, regulatory issues. You are starting with the US, but because you already have so many interests coming from other countries, do you think by proving what's already happening in the US, you might have a smoother run with regulations in other countries?
It's a great question. Yeah, we decided to go with the United States. It has a very well-developed regulatory system. It is very challenging. A lot of people would say, well, why don't you just build it on some island somewhere? Or I'm like, where would you get the fuel? Some kind of black market? So there's really not a hack. We felt like we had to do it the right way, the hard way, and just start in the United States. That's where our company is based, and that's where we saw the earliest markets. But really, we're interested in going anywhere where we have customers. So we do see for areas that have less developed regulatory systems, they do like the idea of having it, our design, our plant having gone through the rigorous process that we see in the United States. So we decided to do it the hard way first.
If you think about it, I mean, it's essential infrastructure, and this ties in with my question as well. Beyond safety, how do you manage security challenges of decentralized nuclear sites? Also, great question from the floor. Really cool.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you notice in the renderings, and they're beautiful renderings, but they don't have fences and so forth. And that's actually not just because we wanted to keep it looking pretty. It's actually because fundamentally it's safer that way. Because we already have designed it so that it is safe against those kinds of attacks. It uses low enriched fuel, which is fundamentally, there's a reason why there's a definition of what's low enriched. It's not fundamentally a target. In the same way that high enriched fuel can be. And actually having armed guards is more of a risk on site than it is not having armed guards. And I think with a lot of recent events around the world, in the last couple of years, we've probably seen how having arms on site can actually escalate things more than de-escalate things, and the hazards of having people on site with guns. So actually, the security is very strong. There's fundamental reasons that I can't even go into, but it's actually, security is a solved problem, more or less.
Okay, and you were mentioning basically mostly physical attacks right now, but what about the cybersecurity issues where you have data hacks, where basically maybe the plant is just not really operational any longer?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know, and it's a really interesting question. I'm glad you asked it. No nuclear plant, at least in the United States, and I don't believe around the world, has their actual nuclear plant connected to the grid, to the internet. They actually still use analog parts in all existing commercial plants in the United States. So analog. So that's how backwards this industry is in one sense, but it is a way of air gapping for sure, because there is no way to hack the safety systems. They can hack into data and other things. But when we look at the same thing, actually we don't have operator actions on site, so there's nothing to hack into in terms of doing that. The worst that a hacker could do is shut down the plant, which is not great for the people relying on the power, but because of the inherent safety, that leads to the inherent security of the plant.
Of course, also a question from the floor that's probably you've been asked many times before. How are you going to deal with radioactive waste? How the plant security will be ensured, and how competitive are small grids in big cities?
Yeah, no.
Three questions in one.
Those are three questions. I feel like we addressed the security one, and the radioactive waste is actually part of our goal. So by using what's called, and I said our technology more vaguely, but by using fast fission, you can actually fission most of the long-lived radioactive waste. And that's where we're getting that energy out of existing nuclear waste. So we're actually reducing the lifetime of the waste and utilizing a majority of the energy left in it. So that's a big part of our passion. That's really the only way you do deal with nuclear waste, is by using it in a fast reactor and turning it into energy, because otherwise we're looking at how do we store this existing waste around the world for a long time. So we want to do it by turning it into clean energy.
Okay, thank you so much. We're out of time, but if anybody has questions for Caroline, please just ping her on the app or later on. Thank you so much for being here.
Much.